Okay, good evening and welcome to Chapter 1 of FSA 105, and we're going to talk about the introduction to the roles and responsibilities of the fire officer. This curriculum does come directly from NFPA Standard 1021, the qualifications for a fire officer. So if you have taken any of the fire officer series leading to certification, this material might look a little familiar to you. Otherwise, fasten your seatbelt and we'll walk you right through it. The objectives for an entry-level fire officer or Fire Officer 1, a frontline supervisor, you have to be able to describe the functions of management and also discuss the roles, regulations, policies, and standard operating procedures that apply to that first line supervisor in the fire station. As I mentioned, the standard for fire officer professional qualifications, NFPA Standard 1021, sets forth the qualifications and the things that you must be proficient at in order to be certified at the fire officer level. There are 4 levels of certification for fire officer: Fire Officer 1, 2, 3, and 4. Fire Officer 1 is the one we're going to be dealing with primarily in this course, and that is the first line supervisor, typically either a sergeant or a lieutenant or possibly even a captain in the fire company. Fire Officer 2 would then be the next level of responsibility, typically a captain or battalion chief level. Fire Officer 3 leads more into the administration of the fire company and is typically an assistant or deputy chief position. And of course, the Fire Officer 4 is the senior level or chief officer qualification. These certifications are done in progressive sequence, which is to say that you must do them in progressive order. You have to be qualified to Fire Officer 1 before you can sit for Fire Officer 2, 3, and 4, and so on. So the primary responsibilities of the fire officer is being a leader and that frontline supervisor. You're directly in supervision of other firefighters, perhaps for the first time. And that responsibility often involves managing a budget for the station and ensuring that those public tax dollars, in most cases, are being used wisely and legally. It is also up to the company level officer to understand and have intimate knowledge of their first due response district, where the streets are, the buildings, and particular target hazards especially. It is incumbent upon the company officer also to know operational procedures for the department, what to do in a given situation. And the company level officer also needs to be able to manage an incident and keep that incident operating in a safe and prudent manner until relieved by a higher ranking officer. The fire officer also needs to have a good understanding of fire prevention methods, fire and building codes, systems and ordinances, and also the department's records management system, because documentation is the life and death of a fire department. If it isn't documented, it never happened. Additional requirements of the entry-level fire officer are to be able to supervise a single fire suppression unit or company, or perhaps a small administrative group within a fire department, perhaps say a fire prevention bureau. The company officer achieves goals by working through subordinates, delegating responsibilities, and then following up with those subordinates to see how their work is progressing. And in almost every case, the company officer must prioritize multiple demands upon his time and resources, and use his resources wisely. Other administrative duties of the Fire Officer 1 include keeping records, managing projects, preparing budget requests for the following budget year, initiating and completing station maintenance requisitions, or getting the supplies that your firefighters need in order to do their job, and also conducting preliminary investigations. And this is not limited to solely fire investigations, but it may be an investigation into an allegation of misconduct upon one of your firefighters, where a preliminary investigation needs to be done to see if it is worthy of pushing it up the food chain to a chief officer for further investigation. Supervisory duties of that company level officer also involve making work assignments, making sure that the station duties and department responsibilities are taken care of in a timely fashion, and also ensuring that health and safety procedures are followed at all times in order to keep the crew safe and healthy. Non-emergency duties include developing pre-incident plans, commonly referred to as pre-plans, also directing or providing company-level training for the firefighters under their command, delivering public education programs or delegating that responsibility to somebody on that company officer's platoon, and also responding appropriately to community inquiries. Emergency duties of the Fire Officer 1 can involve supervising a group of firefighters at an incident scene, functioning as the initial arriving officer at the emergency scene, or the officer in command until properly relieved by a senior officer, or termination of the event. They are responsible for performing initial scene size-up and also establishing the incident management system, or establishing command. They then develop and implement an incident action plan, which for most minor incidents that we're involved with, that incident action plan exists only in the incident commander's head. It is never formally committed to paper. The officer is also responsible in an emergency situation for deploying resources that are available to him, maintaining accountability for all personnel on scene, conducting any preliminary investigation, and securing the scene to preserve evidence for later investigation. And after the incident has concluded, the company officer should be responsible for conducting a post-incident analysis. Notice we did not use the word critique here, because the idea of a post-incident analysis is not to find fault in anyone, but simply to learn from what happened at the incident with the goal of doing better the next time. A Fire Officer 1 is also required to meet Firefighter 2 requirements. This term used by International Association of Fire Chiefs is the supervising fire officer, which should be used interchangeably with Fire Officer 1 or that company level officer. The Fire Officer 1 supervises and directs a single unit or company. This can be an engine company, a squad company, a truck company, or a rescue company, or some combination of any of those. They instruct members on procedures, respond to alarms with their company, and typically assumes command of emergency scenes unless a senior ranking officer is present. And they're still responsible for administering emergency medical first aid, either to civilians in need or perhaps to other members of the company who may become injured at the incident scene. The officer is responsible for overseeing apparatus maintenance, and most especially making sure that all the equipment trusted to his care is kept in a ready state and able to be deployed at any given time when an alarm is received. The company officer typically receives direction and instruction from either the captain and or the battalion chief on duty, again depending on the size of the department and how it is organized. The officer usually provides training on apparatus operations to firefighters under their command. He evaluates their performance and then reads and applies procedures, department SOPs, and standard operating orders. The fire officer completes or maintains records, prepares necessary reports such as incident reports, injury on duty reports, or accident reports. He performs pre-incident planning activities, getting ready for that big incident at that target hazard. Conducts occupancy inspections, or sometimes referred to as company inspections, of certain buildings in their district. They oftentimes determine fire cause and origin for minor incidents, and conducts public education programs for the public. They may also assist in fire safety inspections of larger, more complex properties. They participate in and oversee equipment inspection and testing. In my department, every morning after roll call, every single member of the department on duty went down to the truck floor and we oversaw, or actually did, the equipment and apparatus check for the day. And every shift that happened, every 10 or 14 hours, that piece of apparatus was taken and tested and made sure to be in working order and ready for duty. The fire officer also works directly in firefighting activities, not only directing, but usually participating directly in firefighting activities. They may take action on the maintenance needs of equipment, buildings, and grounds, either doing or supervising the repair themselves, or perhaps putting in a work order for the municipal garage or a third-party vendor to do the service maintenance as required. They supervise and perform maintenance and cleaning work. Now, just because they're an officer does not mean that they don't get their hands dirty. Some of the best officers that I've seen are down there on the truck floor with their troops, rolling up their sleeves and doing what needs to be done alongside of their troops. The fire service in the United States started as communities of citizens who responded to fires. These were usually very loosely organized groups of people who were civic-minded and were committed to improving their community by making sure that they were safe from hostile fires. Today, there are different approaches to volunteer fire departments. Some volunteer departments do not pay their members anything at all. Some volunteer departments pay by the number of responses, using a point system usually, and some combination and career volunteer or paid on-call personnel get paid for each call that they attend to. And the last category, of course, is the all-career department, where every firefighter is a paid member of the municipal or city service that provides fire protection. The history of the fire service goes back to 24 BC, where Roman Emperor Augustus Caesar created the Familia Publica, or the public family, with the purpose of keeping the community safe from fire. Later, in 60 AD, the Emperor Nero established the Corps of Vigiles, and the Vigiles walked around the city of Rome at night and made sure that fires were extinguished, or if they were left to burn, that they were able to do so safely. In the United States, or should I say North America, the first documented fire company in North America was in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. A few years later, in 1630, Boston established the first fire regulations in North America, and largely had to do with standards for construction of new buildings, where at that time a fire in a single wooden building could endanger the entire settlement. In 1735, the first organized volunteer fire company was established in Philadelphia. This was established by Benjamin Franklin. Two major fires in 1871 affected the development of the fire service and fire codes. We've all heard of the Great Chicago Fire, allegedly started by Mrs. O'Leary's cow when she kicked over a lantern. While the origins of that story have been thoroughly debunked, we do know that the Great Chicago Fire was most likely caused by a fire used for cooking, laundry, in the backyard of a wood frame home in downtown Chicago. What very few people know, however, that on the very same day the Great Chicago Fire occurred, the Great Fire of Peshtigo, Wisconsin occurred, which burned many times more land and killed more people and destroyed more buildings than the Great Chicago Fire. So if the Peshtigo, Wisconsin fire was so great, how come nobody ever heard of it? Very simple. Peshtigo, Wisconsin was somewhat remote, and there was a single telegraph line to get news in and out of Peshtigo. The fire consumed that single telegraph line, leaving Peshtigo with no way to be able to call for help to any other communities or to report the news of the fire. It was only the next day, when a railroad train tried to make its way up the single track into Peshtigo, when it discovered that the railroad ties holding the tracks in place had burned away, and the city was essentially decimated. Fire equipment progressed from buckets, usually leather buckets, to hand-powered pumpers, to steam-powered pumpers, and then machine-powered pumpers, and ultimately into the modern fire apparatus that we are familiar with today. The municipal water systems evolved as well, to which villages often depended upon a single central well for water. This was then improved, and a series of hollowed out wooden tree trunks were used to carry water, and later the municipal water system that we are familiar with today. In terms of communication, the progression came from the fire warden or night watchman who, if they witnessed a fire, would simply yell and run down the street banging on doors and yelling, "Fire! Fire! Fire!" to alert the residents to the hazard. This progressed to public call boxes, which were based on a telegraph system. And the call boxes would tap out a telegraph code indicating the location of that box, and that would mean that was the rough location of the fire. An interesting bit of trivia that fire officers back in the day had to know Morse code, because once they got to the scene, they would go to the call box, and if they needed a second alarm for more manpower, they had to be able to communicate that by telegraph through the call box system. Needless to say, we have more immediate and effective communication systems today, involving the internet, involving FM two-way radio systems, and a whole host of other means of communication that are much more effective and much more immediate. Two-way radios and electronic amplification systems enable fire units and firefighters to stay in contact. Before two-way radios had been invented, the chief officer shouted commands through a brass trumpet to their firefighters on the line. There were very few building codes in colonial times. Building codes governed construction materials and frequently required built-in fire prevention and safety measures. Today, model codes are written by national organizations, such as the NFPA and the International Code Council. Many early volunteer fire departments were funded either by donations from the public or on a subscription basis. Many still rely on this funding model. It was interesting to note that the subscribers to a particular fire company would typically put a fire mark on their building. The fire mark would indicate who they had made a donation to, and in this case, Eagle Hose number 2 would be the company that was responsible for providing fire protection for this particular building. If, for example, the building owner did not make their annual contribution to Eagle Hose number 2, the fire company would come and remove the plaque from the front of the building, meaning that they would not respond to any fires in that building. Fire insurance companies were established to help property owners cope with financial losses from fires. If it had a fire mark on the front of the building, then that building was covered, and any fire there would be covered by that particular insurance company and no other. It didn't take very much training or education for the early firefighters. The first firefighters simply required to be very strong and to have good endurance. As firefighting equipment became more complex, formal training and good judgment became more important. In today's fire service, it is not uncommon to find a company level officer or even a firefighter with either a bachelor's or even a master's degree or higher. Sophisticated technical equipment, including large vehicles of increasing complexity, radios, computers, thermal imaging cameras, and self-contained breathing apparatus, are now commonplace. However, what does remain is the most important resource on the fire ground is still the firefighter. The firefighter is still the person who makes it happen on the fire ground. Without the firefighter, all the most important and expensive equipment is useless. Fire departments organize themselves and draw their authority from the town, the city, the county, the township, or a special fire district. In almost every case, the fire chief is held accountable to that governing body. The chain of command creates structure for managing the department during non-incident operations and also directing fireground operations during a fire incident. The ranks in a fire department vary, but typically what you see on the chart in front of you is an organization, a model for organization for the fire company, where the fire chief is at the top of the chart. Directly underneath him is either an assistant or a deputy chief. Under him is a battalion chief or a district chief. And then the captain is usually the senior company level officer or station officer, followed by a lieutenant and a firefighter. Now sometimes you'll see ranks thrown out there such as firefighter first class or a private or a sergeant, and these ranks are all interchangeable, but they do conform to a rigid rank system. The basic principles of organization involve a paramilitary style of leadership, and there are several principles that this is based upon: unity of command, span of control, division of labor, and also discipline. Unity of command means that each firefighter answers to one supervisor. Every supervisor answers to one boss, and a direct route of responsibility leads from the fire chief down to the firefighter. In this organizational chart, you can see where the department is divided into emergency response units and non-emergency response units, where the fire chief again is at the top. The assistant chief for operations is to the left, and underneath him is the battalion chief or the shift commander, and then each station has a captain who's responsible for the companies in that station. But off to the right, you'll see another assistant chief who's the fire marshal. Now, they're usually a sworn firefighter and usually a very experienced firefighter, but their primary responsibility is maintaining the Fire Prevention Bureau, the fire inspectors, and the fire protection engineers. In a lot of departments, in a major incident, these individuals will be pulled from their administrative duties and put to work on the line. Now, with this rigid manpower system, we have to maintain span of control. Span of control is simply the maximum number of personnel or activities that one individual can control. Usually a number between 3 and 7. Less than 3, and there really isn't much of a need for a supervisor, and above 7, it becomes difficult to maintain control over 7 or more people. So actually, the ultimate number is about 5. The division of labor means that we have a way of organizing an incident. It breaks down the overall global strategy into smaller tasks, and this prevents duplication of job assignments. Discipline includes orders from superior officers, standard operating procedures, suggested operating guidelines, and policies. Discipline can either be positive or corrective in nature. Other views of an organization, meaning the organization might be arranged differently by function or the type of unit, such as engine companies and truck companies. By geography, there might be a North District and a South District, or a Northeast and a Southwest District. And also by staffing, perhaps organized by career and paid on call or volunteer status. The functions of management include planning and organizing. Planning is simply developing a scheme, program, or method to accomplish an objective. Organizing, it means putting the resources together into an orderly, functioned, and structured whole in order to accomplish the overall plan. Leading involves guiding or directing to a course of action, and controlling involves restraining, regulating, governing, counteracting, or overpowering. There's a little difference there between leading and controlling. The rules and regulations of the fire company are developed by government or government-authorized organizations. Rules and regulations of the department leave very little room for latitude or discretion. For example, wearing a seatbelt when riding in a vehicle, whether it's an emergency apparatus or a city-owned vehicle, wearing a seatbelt is always mandatory. The policies of the department provide guidelines for present and future actions. Oftentimes, the policies require judgment on the best course of action within the policy, or giving the company officer a certain amount of leeway in order to achieve the objectives of the policies. For example, maintaining a station's sidewalk safety in winter. The policy may not specifically say you will shovel the walk every hour or every 2 hours and apply salt to icy areas. Or it may just say that the company officer is responsible for maintaining the station sidewalks in a safe manner at all times. Standard operating procedures within the fire company are written organizational directives that establish routine methods to follow for designated operations or actions. These are developed within the fire department. For example, a systematic process for vertical ventilation. Or it could be a standard operating procedure, or SOP, stating that all fire department personnel, when operating at a traffic incident, will wear a high visibility reflective vest. Most of the time, fire officers make ethical or right decisions. Whenever we hear about a firefighter making unethical choices, there are negative consequences for the individual and for the organization. We have to remember that every single action we take, or in some cases do not take, reflects upon the organization that we work for. In order to make ethical choices and decisions, we have to have a code of ethics, a line in the sand that we will not cross. We have to select employees for hire who share those values. We have to ensure the top management exhibits ethical behavior, because if the folks at the top of the organization are observed committing unethical behavior, what incentive is there for folks lower in the food chain to do so? There's none. So leadership starts at the top with good ethical behavior. We have to have clear job goals and a very well-written job description for every position in the fire company, so everybody knows exactly what their job is. And we also have to have performance appraisals, where the supervisor periodically appraises the workers or firefighters under their command and gives them creative feedback or positive feedback on how they might do their job better. And the officer might also be tasked with implementing an ethics training program. One of the best examples I've ever heard of an ethics training program is called the New York Times test. Whenever you're faced with a decision in the fire company, you have to ask yourself, if my decision was posted on the front page of the New York Times tomorrow, would I be proud of that? And if the answer is no, then there may be an ethical challenge with that decision. In summary, the qualification standards for fire officers are documented in NFPA Standard 1021, the standard for fire officer professional qualifications. At the fire officer 1 level, or company officer level, the emphasis is placed on accomplishing goals and objectives through subordinates. Very often, this is the first time that that individual has been placed in a leadership role, and they have to apply policies, procedures, and rules to their subordinates. The U.S. Fire Service originated as communities of citizens banding together for the public good. Building codes prevent, limit, and contain fires. Formalized training is important, as is documentation that that formalized training did indeed occur. And also, the chain of command creates a structure for the department. The chain of command also creates an environment for the department to thrive. If the command environment is toxic, very little productivity will ensue. The fire department uses a paramilitary style of leadership with a clear and concise chain of command. There are several ways to look at the organization of a fire department, whether it be all career, combination career and volunteer, paid on call, or sometimes the pure volunteer model. The 4 functions of managing are planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. Fire officers must absolutely know their department's regulations, policies, and SOPs off by heart. Ethical choices are based on the values of the individual and of the organization. This concludes the Chapter 1 video lesson for FSA 105. After reading Chapter 1, you should be ready for the Chapter 1 assessment.